exactly.
So it's an hour and a half.
Mm-hmm. And you can split up the hour and a half however you like. You can take questions along the way, or you can push them off to the end. We typically have, a good 10 minutes at least for questions to sort of just be collected to save to the end, especially if people are asking questions sort of in the chat box, which is hard to follow along, in real time.
Okay. Yeah, I should make sure I have chat up.
Oh, so don't worry about you following along with chat.
Okay.
I don't think it's reasonable to expect a presenter to be doing that.
Okay, great. But yeah, I mean, of course, people should feel free to interrupt with questions, I guess, as usual. So if that's what you'd usually do, that would be great.
Yep. Yeah, so I guess we'll just pop in if there's a hand up or there's questions.
Yeah.
Okay, we're a couple minutes past 2:30, so I think we can go ahead and get started. We're very excited to welcome Peter Spittal from the University of Bristol, who's going to talk to us about benefit salience and labor supply. So whenever you're ready, Peter, take it away.
Okay, great. Well, thanks, Stephen, for the introduction, and thank you, everyone, for having me today. It's a shame not to be able to visit in person in Reading, not just because I'm desperate to get out of my house, but also because it would have been nice to meet you in person. So hopefully at some point we can meet in the future, and it's great to be able to talk to you today about this paper, Benefit Salience and Labour Supply. So I want to start with what I hope is quite an uncontroversial statement, and then we can maybe go from there, which is that benefit and tax systems are kind of famously very complicated. So like welfare systems in general and tax systems as well are very complex. And they would typically require participants or individuals to perhaps keep track of multiple schedules. So for example, if you're an individual who is paying income tax and also claiming some income related benefit, you'd need to keep track of both schedules separately. If you're claiming multiple different benefits, then it's kind of even more complex. And these different schedules have different thresholds and taper rates and eligibility rules and amounts that people would be required to keep track of when they're trying to decide about making optimal decisions about consumption and labour supply. And in addition to these kind of perhaps standard forms of complexity, another feature of welfare systems is that many programs have important dynamic features. So you might think of time-limited benefits, perhaps unemployment insurance, as is administered in many countries like the US, not in the UK, where you'll receive a benefit for a certain amount of time and then that benefit will run out. And in fact, I'm going to study a policy that's kind of like this in spirit in this paper. But also pensions, where the amount that you pay into a pension pot today will only pay off at some point in the future, and you're required to understand the function that maps your contribution today to your pension pot in future. And also some kind of private health insurance schemes have important dynamic elements too. So in this paper, the question I'm going to ask is, are people aware of these dynamic features of the welfare system and try and think about the consequences for their behavior and our design of welfare systems? So just to kind of pause here and think about, why is this a question that we might be interested in? Well, so these dynamic features of the welfare system are different in some pretty I think important ways from the kind of static incentives that have typically been studied in this literature on tax and benefit salience. In particular, these policies are typically higher stakes. So, you might think if you don't understand important features of your pension, then you could be left with a big shock potentially at some point in the future. In some ways, these dynamic features are more complex also. And it might be harder to learn about these dynamic features of welfare systems because the feedback that you get is infrequent and perhaps delayed from the time that you make a decision. So, for example, there have been papers that look at people's understanding of sales taxes. That's what I would think of as a static incentive. And with sales taxes, you kind of get feedback on what the level of tax is every time you make a transaction, whereas that's not the case with, for example, your pension, where your contributions will only pay off at some point in the future. So I think these dynamic features of welfare systems are important to understand, whether people understand them, because they can have implications for people's behavior. You know, how are people going to respond if we introduce a time-limited benefit, for example, and also might help us understand better about the normative implications of some of these policies that are designed to redistribute in some sense, but could introduce costs if they leave people to make errors. So in particular, in this paper, what I do is I study a feature of the UK welfare system as it was in the early 2000s. And I study the salience of a very large lump sum and, in principle, foreseeable reduction in benefits that arose for kind of low-income families as their children aged out of eligibility for the UK's child tax credit. This was a kind of flagship welfare program in the UK from 2003 until it started to be replaced in around 2013. And kind of the key thing for now to keep in mind is that this is a benefit that these kind of low-income households could claim until their child reached a certain age threshold, which is around 18. And when the kid reached 18, these families would lose around £2,500 of benefit income a year. And this is a really substantial amount of money, given that these are kind of low-income households. So this can be kind of 40% of the benefits that these households are entitled to, roughly. So this is a kind of really big reduction, and it's lump sum. And in this context, I'm going to try to answer three kind of more specific questions. So the first question is just simply, are families aware of the rules that link their benefit entitlement to the age of their children under the UK welfare system? And an important part of answering this question is going to be also, are we able to rule out some kind of alternative stories and other explanations which will perhaps come to your mind when I show you my results? And I'm going to try and convince you that we can rule out lots of alternative stories. So I'm going to claim that I can show that families were not aware of these rules, or at least a large fraction of them were not aware. Second question is going to be, do they learn about these rules through experience? So this is maybe an interesting question on its own, because it might shed light on the way that people interact with welfare systems and the way that they are able to kind of form a view of what their entitlement will be. Oh, we have someone in the waiting room. But answering this question will also help in ruling out some of these alternative explanations that I think is important to do in this context. And then finally, I'm going to ask, what are the welfare costs of people not being aware that their benefits will fall with the age of their children? And how does this change our assessment of how effective this policy is as a redistributive tool? Okay. So to give just a kind of bird's eye view of the paper and a preview of the results, and then I'll kind of go into more details about everything. So the paper's in two parts, broadly. So in the first part of the paper, I study labour supply responses of parents, particularly mothers, at the time that they lose entitlement for the child tax credit as a result of their child aging out of eligibility. And so at the center of the test that I have here is a kind of simple idea, which is that in a standard life cycle model of consumption and labour supply, if an individual or a household is aware that they're going to lose entitlement to some benefits at some point in the future, and crucially, if this reduction in benefits is going to be just purely lump sum, then that household or individual would want to smooth their marginal utility at around the time of this reduction in benefits. And so there would be no contemporaneous response to labour supply or consumption at the time of this reduction in benefits. Whereas if it was the case that households were not aware of the rules that were going to generate this reduction in benefit income at some point in the future, then that benefit reduction would come as a shock to them. It would be unforeseen. In particular, it would be a shock to the marginal utility of their lifetime wealth, and in that case, we'd expect to see an increase in labour supply contemporaneous to the reduction in benefits, and a corresponding reduction in consumption. My central result in this first part of the paper is just this. I find a large labour supply adjustment at the time of the, in principle, foreseeable lump sum reduction in benefits. And I'll explain a lot more about my empirical strategy for how I get to this result. But just for now, this comes out of a difference in differences empirical design, where the thing that I'm trying to hold constant is any potential direct effect of the child's age on the labour supply of their parents. So we may think that, when kids turn 18, maybe their mothers will start working more anyway, perhaps because there's less of a time requirement for them to be at home, or perhaps for some other mechanism. So in my empirical strategy, I have a control group of mothers who have children of the same age as those who experience this lump sum reduction in benefit income when their child crosses this threshold, but who don't have a reduction in benefit income. So I'll explain more about this. But the central thing here is I'm trying to hold this direct effect of child age on labour supply constant. But there are other potential explanations for finding a labour supply increase in response to this, in principle, foreseeable benefit reduction, which would not be to do with the salience of the policy, and so would potentially have different policy implications and certainly different welfare implications. So, for example, you might be thinking that perhaps these households, it's not that they're just not aware of this specific rule in the welfare system, but perhaps they're just myopic in general and not forward-looking at all in any respect or in any other domain. Or it could be that you're thinking that these households could be time inconsistent, and so despite knowing that their benefits will fall at some point in the future, just failing to accumulate sufficient savings in the period leading up to it to be able to properly smooth their marginal utility around the time of this, at the time of this reduction. So to try and rule out some of these other explanations, I exploit a really key benefit, and I think a really unusual feature of the environment that I study, which is that families with multiple children will experience a sequence of similarly sized reductions in benefit income as each of their children ages out of eligibility. And so I say this is an unusual feature of the environment because the policy, as it was in the period that I study it, actually was the amount of benefits that you were able to claim was a linear function of the number of children you had, or at least your maximum entitlement was just a linear function of the number of children you had and not bounded above. So, for example, if you had 5 children, you would be entitled to 5 times as much, roughly, as a family who had only 1 child. And so each child aging out of eligibility would lead to the same size benefit reduction. So I exploit that. And I find 2 kind of key results, which I think are quite powerful in the sense they allow me to rule out, I think, a broad set of alternative explanations for this finding. So the first of these kind of auxiliary results is that I find that all of the labour supply response that I detect is concentrated on families who lose entitlement for child tax credit for the first time. So all of this response is concentrated on the first child to age out of eligibility, with a numerically small and statistically insignificant response at the time any subsequent child ages out. So this is consistent with families being initially unaware that their benefits will be linked to the age of their children, but then learning about this through their experience with the system, and then not responding at the time subsequent children age out of eligibility. The second of these auxiliary results I find is if you think of families with relatively more or relatively fewer remaining children after, so if you think of a family with 4 children and a family with 2 children, at the time the first child ages out of eligibility, the information shock to the marginal utility of lifetime wealth, to the kind of lifetime total resources, is larger for the larger family, because they learn that not only have they lost £2,500 today, but they're going to lose three times £2,500 again in the future as their other children age out of eligibility. So by this reasoning, you'd expect, if families are learning about these rules through experience, that the labour supply response would be bigger for families with more remaining dependent children at the time their first child aged out of eligibility. And I find this in the results as well. And I'll discuss in a bit more detail why I think that these results are able to rule out some alternative explanations. So that's the first part of the paper, to use these empirical results to identify the existence of a non-salient dynamic policy feature in the context of a kind of major welfare policy in the UK. But there are some important questions, I think, that we might want to answer, that it's not possible to answer just directly from these reduced form results, owing to the kind of fundamentally dynamic nature of the setting that I'm studying. In particular, to assess the welfare implications, I develop a structural life cycle labour supply model, which is standard in almost all respects, except for I allow for the link between a child's age and entitlement to benefits to be potentially non-salient. So for the households in the model to incorrectly forecast how their benefits might change in future as a function of the age of their children. I estimate key parameters of the model by indirect inference, using my empirical results from the first part of the paper as targets. And then I use this estimated model to calculate the welfare costs of non-salients. So just 3 kind of headline takeaways from this second part of the paper for now, and then I'll kind of dive into the details. First thing I find, I guess kind of reassuringly in a sense, that the preference parameters that I estimate using my empirical results from the first part of the paper as targets are closely in line with existing literature. So I take this as reassuring that my empirical results are consistent quantitatively as well as qualitatively with this story of non-salience and learning, because they imply otherwise standard behavior given the model. The second thing is that I estimate the proportion of households which my empirical results imply are unaware of the eligibility rules, using the structure of the model to kind of disentangle different effects. And I find that this number is really high. So I find that my empirical results imply that over 80% of households are initially unaware that their benefits will be linked to the age of their children at the time the first child ages out. And I should kind of be careful here, I think, in saying that when I say that the households are unaware, this doesn't necessarily mean that they never knew that part of their benefit receipt was because they had children. It's just that at the time, as they're going through their life cycle and at the time they're making decisions, this is not kind of front of mind, and it kind of slips them. It could be that it just slips their mind that part of their benefits will fall in, say, 10 years when their kid turns 18. And the third takeaway from the structural model is I estimate the welfare costs, and I find these also to be substantial as well. So I find that the welfare costs of non-salients in this setting are equivalent to cutting the generosity of the child tax credit by 14%. So kind of the takeaway, I think, from the 2 parts of the paper together is that I provide evidence for a previously undocumented non-salient policy feature, and I show that the welfare costs of this are substantial, in a sense that I think it really affects the way that we assess the effectiveness of this policy. In a sense, the policy is 14% less effective at redistributing than we might otherwise have thought it was. So I think this paper contributes to a few literatures. I don't particularly want to linger on this slide. I think one thing that I'd perhaps highlight about the paper that is that I think it's very important to, in this kind of salience literature or in the kind of behavioral public finance literature, to distinguish between different competing mechanisms which may be observationally equivalent in some settings. And I think that's important because the policy implications can be very different, and I think that's ultimately what we're interested in. And so I contribute by I hope convincing you that this is non-salience and not some other friction or behavioral feature. Okay, so I'll maybe pause. I don't see any hands. So I should say as well, just please do feel free to interrupt if you have questions. So the outline for the rest of the talk is to basically fill in the details from this introduction. So I'll start by telling you more about the policy environment and the child tax credit in the UK. I'll then explain my empirical strategy in the first part of the paper for this difference in difference to find the labour supply responses, and I'll tell you more about the data that I use. Then I'll go through the empirical results and explain in a bit more detail how I think these allow us to distinguish between competing mechanisms. Finally, I will outline the life cycle labour supply model. I'll provide a sketch of the model, and then I'll go into the estimates and finally the welfare analysis. Okay, so the child tax credit in the UK, this is the central policy that I focus on in this paper, was the primary source of support for low-income families in the UK welfare system from the time of its introduction in 2003 until the beginning of its phased replacement in 2013. So people who are aware of kind of what's been going on with welfare policy in the UK will know that the government has started trying to replace the previous system of tax credits with what's known as universal credit. This started happening in 2013, but it's been slow and very messy. And so until recently, and I think even now, there are still some people claiming child tax credit, but it started to get replaced in 2013. And so I just focus on this 10-year period where it was the only source of support in the UK welfare system. And this reached kind of 5.5 million families a year at a substantial cost to the taxpayer. So the child tax credit provides a direct transfer to eligible families, and I'll tell you more about the amount and the schedule on the next slide. But the kind of key feature of the policy that I focus on in this paper is this age eligibility threshold. So most children, kind of around 85% of children, become ineligible to be claimed at the age of 18. There's actually a bit of a wrinkle around this. So technically, a child can continue to be claimed up until age 20 if they're still in non-advanced education. So that's any education up to but not including an undergraduate degree. So for example, if a student was still doing A-levels by age 20, if they kind of perhaps repeated or started late. But really, you should have in mind that the threshold is age 18, that a family can stop claiming for their child. The other thing that I'd like to just underline, which I think is quite important, especially for people who may be used to tax credits in other countries, perhaps in the US, is that this is really a tax credit in name only. So really you should think of this as a welfare payment or a transfer or a benefit payment. So this is paid as a direct transfer into claimants' bank accounts, and it's unrelated to tax liability. So in particular, the amount of tax credit that you can claim can well exceed the amount of tax that you pay in a given tax year. That's kind of completely allowed under the UK system. And this is unlike, for example, the way that child tax credits are administered in the US, where they're administered as a reduction in tax liability at the end of the year, supposing that you owed enough tax. Another, I think, interesting and important feature of this policy is that it was paid jointly with another benefit called the working tax credit. So the working tax credit was not at all related to children. But if a household was entitled to claim both, the payments would be bundled together and paid together. And there's some evidence from government research, actually, some survey evidence from government research that claimant households really weren't able to tell you how much of what they received was due to child tax credit and how much of what they received was due to working tax credit. And I think this could be kind of something that's driving my findings, that people don't know that they're going to lose benefits when their children reach a certain age. Okay, so this is the child tax credit schedule for a representative year in this 10-year period that I study. This is for 2010-11. I think one thing I should say actually as well is that over this 10-year period that I study, the policy was kind of pretty stable. So there weren't major reforms during this period. So I'm thinking of exploiting a feature of a policy that was quite well established and wasn't kind of changing a lot. So so I'm not exploiting a reform in this paper. I should be very upfront about that. It's an exogenous variation that arises as part of the policy. Okay, so in this figure on the x-axis, we have monthly household labour income. That's the relevant variable that a family's entitlement is assessed against, their joint household labour income. And on the y-axis, monthly entitlement to child tax credit. There's a couple of things to note here. So the first is that a family's entitlement is declining in their monthly household labour income in this kind of two-step manner. So first, the child tax credit starts to be tapered at a rate of around 40%. It's 41% in 2010 for household labour income above some relatively low threshold of 1350. And then a household is entitled to claim a smaller amount, just £45 a month, up to a much higher income threshold, after which entitlement is phased out entirely. So in this figure, I show the child tax credit schedule for a household with one eligible child that they can claim for. And in these kind of successive figures, I show the same schedule, but for a family with 2 and then 3 eligible children. So one thing to note that I alluded to earlier is that if you look at the left of the figure, so the households with the maximum entitlement is just a linear function of the number of children, and this would keep going up for families with 4, 5, 6 children, just in this linear fashion. And this is something that I exploit in the paper, so I'll come back to. And you can think of the effect of a child aging out of eligibility for child tax credit as moving a household down these schedules. So for example, if a 3-child household has their eldest child age out of eligibility, they'll move from facing this red threshold to facing the blue threshold. And then if they go from 2 to 1, they'll go from red to black. And then if they go from 2 to 1, they'll go from black to blue. I want to think through a bit more what the effects of a child aging out of eligibility will be on the budget set facing their parents. And you can perhaps just see from looking at this chart one of three things will happen to their parents' budget constraint. So if we think first of the relatively higher income households, so here in this chart I'm showing a household with 2 children where the eldest becomes ineligible and then they only have 1 eligible child going forward. For the relatively higher income families to the right of the second dashed line, nothing will happen to their budget set as their child ages out of eligibility for child tax credit. Then if we think about the households with this kind of intermediate income between the 2 dashed black lines, the group that I call M, 2 things happen to these households' budget sets. First is they experience a reduction in the amount of child tax credit they can claim. But second, they also experience a reduction in their effective marginal tax rate on income, because they go from facing this taper rate of the child tax credit, 41%, to facing no taper rate at all. Now, even in a standard life cycle labour supply model where households are aware that their benefits will fall at some point in the future, we would expect to see a labour supply adjustment for these families who experience a reduction in their marginal tax rate due to a substitution effect. So the salient story doesn't really have strong predictions, or at least doesn't have strong qualitative predictions for what these households would do separately from what they would do in a standard model. But then if we look on the kind of far left of the figure, the group that I call L, these are the groups that are particularly interesting in this case, because these households experience a lump sum reduction in their benefit entitlement when the child becomes ineligible, but have no change in their effective marginal tax rate. And so these are the households that a standard life cycle labour supply model would say should not have a contemporaneous labour supply adjustment at the time that they lose their benefits. And so the empirical strategy is going to be based upon essentially estimating the labour supply response for those families in group L and using families in group C as a control group. So these are families with children of the same age but who don't experience a reduction in their benefit entitlement. Okay, so that's the policy. So I'll now, so I've kind of alluded to my empirical strategy, I think twice already, so I'll now state it explicitly. So my objective in the empirical strategy in this paper is to identify the causal effect of a lump sum, in principle foreseeable reduction in child tax credit on labour supply. And the reason I'm interested in this is that I think of this as being a lens through which we can learn about the household's expectations about how their budget sets would evolve over time. But the key kind of confounding factor here, the thing that I need to deal with, is that child's age drives entitlement to child tax credit on the one hand, but on the other hand, the child's age may have direct effects on the labour supply of their parents, perhaps through changes to what we might think of as a consumption equivalence scale. You know, perhaps the kids is less dependent on their parents, or perhaps through freeing up parental time, or perhaps any other story that we might want to think of for why parents' labour supply may change systematically with the age of their children. So my strategy here is to compare households with children of the same age, but who experience different changes to their budget sets as their children age over this threshold. So comparing groups L and groups C, this is a diff and diff with the child's age in months relative to becoming ineligible as the time dimension. So the thing that I need you to believe here in order to believe the results is that the direct effect of child's age on the labour supply of their parents would be the same in the treatment as in the control groups. In the paper, I try to be quite careful about this, and I show on the one hand that there's no difference in pre-trends of a mother's labour supply as a function of their child's age. So this is in the period leading up to the child becoming ineligible. The mother's labour supply evolves similarly as a function of child's age in the treatment as it does in the control group. And also there are no other things that happen to the household at the time the child becomes ineligible that differ between the treatment and control group. So, for example, I show in the paper that there's no difference in the probability the child leaves home in the treatment and control group. We might think that this could drive differential labour supply responses. There's also no difference in the probability that the child goes on to higher education, so that's universities, between the treatment and control group. And I think this kind of reflects the policy period in the UK in the early 2000s, where really there was a drive towards getting everyone into university, or at least into some form of higher education. Okay, so
excuse me, can I ask clarification? So your higher income group, does it include a limited income threshold, or is it anyone above the threshold?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So in the main results, I don't put an upper limit on the amount that households can earn. The results are robust to kind of ruling out very high income households. I think one thing I should say is that in the data, I don't have very many very high income households. So I think these are comparable. And certainly, even in the results I'm going to show you today, which just include everyone above the threshold, it's true. These statements that I made on the previous slide about how there seems to be similar pre-trends in labour supply and how there are no differences to household composition at the time of the ineligibility, that's true for both approaches. Okay. But the results I'm going to show you today include everyone above the threshold.
Okay, thank you.
It's a good question. Okay, so my approach here is to have these three groups based on the change in child tax credit that would occur to the household when the child becomes ineligible. The three groups that I showed on the chart, group L, M, and C. And I'm going to run this difference in differences form of regression. So where YIT is some measure of child's I labour supply in month T. My main results, I'm going to focus on labour income, but I'm also going to show results for a binary yes, no working variable, like an extensive margin variable. On working backwards from the end, a set X of observable, potentially time-varying characteristics. A, which is an indicator for whether you're in the period after the child has aged out of eligibility. T, which is a variable that assigns mothers I to treatment groups. And then these betas times the interaction, one beta for group M and one beta for group L separately. And these are the local average treatment effects of on the labour supply response to this reduction in benefit income. And just to be clear, just to reiterate, my main interest here is in only one of these betas, is in beta L for the lump sum group, because this is the group where there's a sharp qualitative prediction where if the lump sum benefit reduction was foreseen, we'd expect beta L to be 0, but if not, we'd expect it to be positive. Okay, so I'm going to implement this empirical strategy using data from the BHPS linked with its successor, the UK HLS. This is kind of the largest household panel study in the UK that covers the entire 10-year period from the introduction of child tax credit in 2003 until 2013. And in particular, I'm going to use data on cohabiting mothers, with their employment status, labour earnings, and other household characteristics at monthly frequency. So I think that's something that's important to stress. This is a survey with annual interviews, but each time an interview is conducted, there's a retrospective employment history covering the previous year. So I'm able to use this information to have data at monthly frequency, which really allows me to kind of zoom in on the timing of labour supply effects relative to losing this child tax credit, which I think is a kind of important benefit here, because you can really see that the labour supply response happens, right at the time that these households lose their entitlement for child tax credit. I'm going to focus in the main analysis on 24 months either side of each child becoming ineligible, although the results are robust using different windows. And I'm going to calculate entitlement to child tax credit based on reported characteristics. So my final sample has around 1,200 mothers with around 1,800, 1,900 children. Okay. So moving now to the empirical results. I'm going to show you, in fact, So I'm going to show you three main empirical results. First, I'm going to show you the results from this difference in differences style regression, as grouping all children together. And then I'm going to show you the results for these two auxiliary specifications, where I am going to distinguish between first and subsequent children, and also between children in large and small families. So these are the first results. This is the overall average labour supply response to a child becoming ineligible. So this top left cell shows that mothers in the treatment group increased their labour supply by £117 a month on average in response to this, in principle, foreseeable lump sum reduction in benefits. This is relative to a pre-period mean of around £500. So this is a large labour supply response, I would claim. And this is in response to an average reduction in child tax credit of £144 a month. So they replace around 80% of their lost benefits. Although I'll explain in a moment that I think that's perhaps not the best way to think about it. But just kind of looking at these results as they are, the households are replacing 80% of their contemporaneous benefit reduction. There's a smaller and in this analysis statistically insignificant response on the extensive margin. That's this binary variable. I'll show you actually in the auxiliary results that there is actually a still small but statistically significant response on this extensive margin. But I think that this reflects potentially two things. So first is that some of the labour supply response that I think is being captured by the income response is an intensive margin. So this is an increase in hours for people who are already working. And second, I think there could actually be a sense in which mothers who are already working increase their labour income by searching for a better job. So that's kind of, I think that's all I'm really able to say on that, but I think that's what's going on here. And the other thing to point out is that by construction, but just to be reassuring, the taper rate, which is this withdrawal rate, doesn't change for these people.
Can I ask here? So yeah. I think I found it, it is very interesting, as initially I thought you were basically looking at probability of working as your main variable, but it makes sense that the labor income is the more responsive one, because yes, my question was the distinction between the intention to replace the benefit versus the actual ability of finding a job, in particular at an older age when a kid. So I mean, this is quite interesting, because this inability to replace the tax credit could be quite, sorry.
That's okay.
Sorry, the inability to replace the credit could be quite important, could have important consequences for the households that is not able to respond in this way on the by increasing labor income. So the implication of that could be quite interesting.
Yeah, so I think that's a good point, and I think also I think just kind of building on this, we may think that there are some households which are maybe wanting to respond but not able to for the reasons that you explain. You know, perhaps it's difficult to find a job at such an old age. Perhaps they've been out of the labour market for so long and they've de-skilled, and kind of this kind of sort of story. So like, I guess in general, a story of frictional labour markets. That's kind of what we're talking about. And I certainly think that could be the case. I would say that the reason that I'm doing this empirical work is to kind of try and shed light on people's understanding of the kind of benefit system. And so if there are these households that are wanting to respond but are constrained against doing so, that would actually kind of make it harder for me to find this kind of response. So, you know, there is some response going on somewhere that I'm able to detect, and there could even be latent responses which I'm not detecting, which would mean that the kind of consequences are even bigger than I'm picking up.
Yes, so if anything, you are underestimating this unexpected, the effect of this unexpected shock.
Yeah, if we think some proportion of households are constrained against adjusting, I'd be yes, exactly. So the kind of takeaway from this is that these findings are inconsistent with a standard life cycle model, because the reduction in benefit income is foreseeable and lump sum, and also because it's such a large reduction that they're going to be facing. You would expect that they would, for example, overcome kind of these Chetty style optimization frictions to adjust if they knew. Okay, and this is kind of showing the results in a graph. Each dot in this is the treatment effect, estimated separately for a 2-month window, where month 0 is the month that the household loses entitlement for child tax credit. The thing that I want you to take away from this is that it looks to me, at least, as though in the period leading up to the child becoming ineligible, there don't seem to be systematically positive or negative treatment effects. So there's no difference between the treatment and control group in the pre-period. But then immediately at the month that the household loses entitlement, there's an increase in labour income, and then this starts to materialize over the next kind of couple of years before flattening out after around 24 months. And so this, I think, is actually consistent with the sort of things that Stefania was just talking about, where maybe if there are frictional labour markets, this kind of evolution of the response might be what we'd expect to see in a frictional labour market with search costs. Okay, so that's the kind of headline result. Now I want to turn to these two auxiliary results. So I'm going to exploit this useful feature of the environment that I explained in the introduction, which is that mothers with more than one child will experience a sequence of similarly sized benefit reductions as each child becomes ineligible. So in this sense, we get to see households making decisions in the same kind of frame at multiple points in time. So I'm going to estimate separate responses for first versus subsequent children. So it may be that we expect that if households learn through experience, then there'd be a bigger labour supply adjustment on the first than subsequent children. And then I'm going to look separately at large versus small families. So here we might think that a household with more remaining dependent children would have a bigger shock at the time they learn about these eligibility rules, and so might adjust their labour supply by more in response. So this table I show in the first column the estimated responses for the first child of a family. The second column is the estimated response for any other child, kind of all grouped together. And the main takeaways here, I think, are that all of the responses that I showed you in the first table are being driven by the first time a household has a child age out of eligibility, with a numerically small and statistically insignificant response at the time any other child ages out. And this is, and one other thing to point out here is that this is despite the reduction in child tax credit being very similar for first and any subsequent children. And in fact, the response is slightly smaller at the time. The hit to child tax credit, the reduction in child tax credit, is slightly smaller, if anything, at the time the first child aged out of eligibility. And that's because if you can remember back to the chart where I showed you the child tax credit schedule, basically the final child to become ineligible, there's a kind of small additional amount. But you know, like, we should have in mind that these are similarly sized benefit reductions.
Okay. Hi. So can I ask? So you would expect then a mother of expecting to lose the second benefit to then smoothing the adjustment, anticipating the loss, and so maybe start increasing the labor income gradually towards the. Is it this what you would expect?
Yeah, I mean, I think actually what you would expect is at the time that they learn that their benefits will fall in future, this permanently affects the marginal utility of their lifetime wealth, in a sense. And so you'd expect them to fully adjust their labor supply at the time they learn to account for both the contemporaneous reduction and their knowledge that it's going to adjust in future.
And can you test this or in so with the treating the first child as, but then it coincides with it's difficult, right? Because there is the learning for the second, but also the response to the first loss.
Yes, so exactly.
Coincide. Yes.
So this actually, I think this motivates the thing I'm going to show you next quite well, actually. So one implication of this story is that if you're forward looking, at the time that your first child becomes ineligible, you respond not just to the benefits you lose today, but also the knowledge that you're going to lose them in future. And so for families with more remaining dependent
larger families,
they learn more about what they're going to lose in the future, and so you'd expect a larger contemporaneous adjustment to labor supply today. And so in this table, this is what we see. So I have 3 columns here. The left column is the labor supply response at the time the first child aged out of eligibility for a large family, where I've defined a large family as having above median number of children, so that's 3 or more in effect.
My only question here is what about, is it relevant the age of the mother having more children? She's might likely to be younger and more likely to be able to make this adjustment. But there's a controlling for age, I guess, would do.
So that's a great point. So yes, I certainly control for age, and also the other thing I do is so I have a treatment and a control group, and they have the same number of children. So here the treatment group has 3 or more children, and the control group has the same size. So and this treatment effect is the difference between the two.
It's basically matching, like.
So it's not. It's kind of like matching, I guess. So like it's not actually matching. It's just it's just so I have this interaction. So I define the treatment group using this kind of T indicator, and you're in, and the control group similarly. So you'd be in treatment group, large family, first child, if you satisfy those conditions, and then you'd be in the control group if you satisfy those family conditions, but just don't.
No, yes, makes sense. Yes.
So here we see that the labor supply response for large families is in fact larger than the labor supply response for smaller families, and this is, I think that this is really consistent with this story of learning about the rules through experience, because you'll notice on the 3rd row for the change in the child tax credit, there are no real differences in the amount of money that these families lose. So there'd be no reason for the labour supply responses to be different, other than the fact that they learn about something in the future that they're going to have more benefit reductions in the future. Okay, so I think these two kind of additional results do. One other thing I should just say on these results is that the magnitude that I find here, this 258 response relative to 150 relative to 0, my structural model that I will come to talking about is able to match these quantitatively. So it's not just qualitatively that these are consistent with the story. I find that actually a standard structural model would imply responses of this size with kind of standard parameters. Okay, so just to kind of discuss the mechanisms a little bit. So I have these two auxiliary results, that all of the response is driven by the first child, and that it's a larger response if there are more remaining eligible children. This is consistent with learning through experience about the rules, which I hope I've kind of been clear on. But they also help to rule out a number of alternative explanations that we wouldn't be able, that I wouldn't be able to say anything about at all if I didn't see mothers making these kind of this sequence of decisions. So, for example, I'm able to rule out that mothers are just entirely myopic in all domains, because if that was the case, then we wouldn't expect all of the response to be concentrated on the first child, because losing child tax credit for a second or third time would come as just as much of a surprise as it did in the first time. And also, we certainly wouldn't expect to see this different response by family size, where it really seems as though people are responding not just to the contemporaneous reduction in benefit income, but also to new knowledge of how the flows will evolve in the future. I think that these results are also able to rule out a story of hyperbolic discounting, where people know that their benefits are going to reduce at some point in the future, but just fail to accumulate sufficient savings to fully smooth marginal utility. Because under a story like that, there would be no reason to expect your time inconsistency to resolve and go away by the time of the second, third, and subsequent children. So if this was a story of hyperbolic discounting, we would expect to see a labour supply response at the time of every child aging out of eligibility as well. And also, we wouldn't expect to see this differential response by family size. And finally, there's a literature that thinks about ways that people interact with complexity in tax systems, which I could potentially be applicable here, where it could be that we think that the families kind of notice that they've lost money, but don't really understand why. And perhaps they misattribute this benefit reduction to some other cause. Maybe they think it's been a change in their tax rate rather than a lump sum reduction, or some story to that effect. I think I'm able to rule this kind of explanation out kind of entirely, because it really does seem as though households are learning the right thing through their experience with the welfare system, because they're able to act in a way that looks optimal once they've learned. So just to drive the point home, I think having this situation where you have multiple children, where you have the same mother with multiple children, allows me to say a little bit more than would be the case if I didn't have access, if I didn't have that kind of variation in the data. And I think ruling out some of these alternative explanations is important, especially when we think about policy or so on. For the interest of time, I'll probably skip robustness, but I'm happy to talk about any of this with people if you're interested, and just get right into the model. So just to recap, we have these empirical results that I claim identify a non-salient feature of the welfare system, and that people learn about it through experience. But there are questions that I'm not able to answer directly from these reduced form empirical results. So one thing we might be interested in is how many households are unaware of these rules. We could it would be a strong claim if I were to say, if I was to try and claim that this is just all households that aren't aware. Like, we might think that some households are better informed than others. How responsive are they to the shock? And importantly, what are the welfare costs of this? And yeah, the fundamentally dynamic nature of the environment makes it difficult to answer these questions just from the empirical results. So I use a structural model, and I rely on the structure of the model to try and answer some of these slightly more difficult questions. Yeah. So I'm going to sketch key features of the model. I'm happy to talk about details if people are interested, or if you have kind of specific questions. So it's a structural life cycle labor supply model of a unitary household, which I think of as an adult couple with up to 5 children. I kind of limit at 5 because there aren't that many households in the data with more than 5 children younger than 18. It's just to kind of save on computation. In the model, the first child can age out of eligibility when the mother is aged 40, 45, or 50. And I match the proportion of households who age out with children at these ages to match the treatment group in the data. And I fix the age gap between children as being 2 years. The household enters the model at age 20 and retires for sure at age 60, and then face some exogenous mortality risk up until age 80. So I think the point to make here is that I'm simplifying the beginning of life up to age 20, and I'm simplifying the end of life after retirement. Like lots of structural models try to focus on these periods of life more than I do, but the real focus for me is on labour supply responses for mothers in their 40s. And so I kind of I really simplified the beginnings and ends of life. The household chooses consumption, savings, female labour supply each year until age 60, and then consume from savings in retirement. Male labour supply is going to be exogenous in the model. Which is, so I have some empirical results in the paper that show that men don't really seem to be responding to this reform, and this is kind of a standard thing to assume, I think. And I model the UK tax and transfer system explicitly from a representative year in the data. So the main feature of the model that's new relative to other structural models of labour supply is that I add this feature that the child-related eligibility rules for benefits may be non-salient. So this may lead a household in the model to misperceive what their future flows of benefit income will be. They may think that they'll be higher than in fact they actually are, and so fail to anticipate these future benefit reductions. So let me just check how I'm doing for time. Okay. So the household problem is to choose equivalized consumption. This is equivalized by family size to take account of changes in actual consumption that may be required as children age out of eligibility. And they make a discrete, and the female in the household makes a discrete labour supply choice from either being out of work, part-time, or full-time, to maximize their expected lifetime utility given their state. Included in the state is a parameter which I call theta, which is either 0 or 1, which indicates whether or not, whether the household is aware of the age-related eligibility rules. So this is the household value function. They want to maximize their expected lifetime utility given their state, subject to their perceived budget constraint. Now, of course, in these kind of structural models, you need to make assumptions on functional forms. So I make what I think are very standard assumptions on functional forms for utility. This in particular draws on a paper by Richard Blundell, Monica Costa-Diaz, Jonathan Shaw, and Costas McGeer, but they're far from the only paper that use these functional forms. So I have this CRRA form for utility multiplied by the cost of work, where the cost of work is given by this parametric form, basically alpha P if you work part-time and alpha F if you work full-time, and 0 if you don't work. The household's budget constraint, well, the household receives income each period from female labor supply, given the endogenous labor supply choice N, male earnings, which is given exogenously but follows an AR1 process, and net transfers from government T. So the male and female ages are AR1 with an age profile. The male employment transitions, so the man can either work or not. This is given exogenously as well and follows a kind of probit model that I estimate from data. So yeah, again, if the child tax credit eligibility rules are non-salient, they may fail to anticipate these future reductions in T. That's how this goes into the model. Okay. So there are 4 key parameters in the model that really drive a household's behavior in response to this benefit reduction. There's the elasticity of intertemporal substitution, the costs of work, and also the proportion of household, well, whether the household is aware of the eligibility rules or not. Those are kind of the important parameters in the model. And I estimate these parameters using the empirical results from the first part of the paper as identifying variation. So I have a kind of heuristic argument that my empirical results are capable of identifying these parameters given the structure of the model. And so while it's of course the case, as with any of these kind of method of simulated moment estimations, that all moments identify all parameters, my identification argument is that the empirical result showing the difference in labor supply response for large versus small families, these are families that have the same contemporaneous reduction in benefit income, but they only differ in how the flows of benefit income are going to change in the future, about the information that they receive, that their flows are going to be different in the future. And so the difference in labor supply responses here are driven solely by new knowledge of future flows of benefit income. This is exactly the sort of variation that you need to identify the elasticity of intertemporal substitution. How does my labor supply change today in response to knowledge about how my benefit income is going to evolve in the future? Then I can use moment. So given knowledge of this elasticity of intertemporal substitution, I can use pre-period employment rates and earnings as targets to identify the fixed costs of full and part-time work. And then given these other parameters, I'm able to, so given these other parameters, it will imply a size of a labor supply response within the model for a household which is unaware of the eligibility rules. And then I'm able to use this knowledge to back out the proportion of households which are unaware of the eligibility rules by comparing the size of that response to the average response that I find in the data, which is going to be, the proportion of households who are unaware of the rules multiplied by this labor supply response plus zeros for the households which were aware. And so my procedure here is a standard two-step method of simulated moments, where I first set the other parameters of the model based on existing literature or my data. And then I iterate on these remaining 4 parameters to ensure that the labor supply responses match the targets given from the empirical part of the paper. So I think this provides quite a kind of close link between the 2 parts of the paper. I'm kind of using the empirical results directly in the estimation of the model. Okay, so and these are the parameter estimates that I get out. So I find a coefficient of relative risk aversion of 2.2. I claim that this is consistent with the existing literature. It's certainly within the range of values that was estimated by Orazio Atanasio and Andrew Weber, and also Richard Blundell's work. It's kind of very similar to the parameters that come out of this literature. And the cost of full and part-time work are very similar to the cost of full and part-time work that was estimated by Blundell, McGeer, Shaw, and Costa Diaz, where they used a different identification strategy, but I find the results are very consistent. So I take that as being reassuring. Sorry, was there a question? No. So yeah, so the point to drive home here is I take it as being reassuring that quantitatively my results imply estimates of these parameters in the models that are consistent with the existing literature, because that means that a standard model of behavior is capable of generating my results quantitatively. Finally, I find the proportion of households that are unaware initially of these eligibility rules is high. I think this number is kind of a policy takeaway from the paper, at 82%. So, 4 in 5 of these households do not adequately anticipate the reduction in benefit income when their first kid ages out of eligibility. This is just a table to show that I do quite well in hitting my targeted moments, which I guess you would expect. I'm going to skip over this. So then just in the final part of the paper, I'd like to talk about the welfare analysis. So here I take the estimated structural model and think about what the welfare implications are of these non-salient eligibility rules. I've also just noticed that my slide numbers are just a lie. I have more than 31 slides. I have 36 slides, I think. But yeah, I'm nearly there. So yes, so the question in this kind of final part of the paper is, how costly are the errors arising from this failure to anticipate the reduction in benefits? So what I do to answer this question is I use the estimated model to calculate the compensating variation, and I use this as the welfare metric. So what does this say? This says how much of a reduction in assets would a household be, so how much of a reduction in assets at the beginning of working life, so at age 20, would a household be willing to accept in order to be informed about these benefit eligibility rules for the entirety of their working life, so that they can consume and save optimally for their entire working life in anticipation of this benefit reduction, rather than being uninformed for the entire of their working life and only learning when their first kid becomes ineligible. So yeah, and I also do an exercise where I think about what effects being informed of the eligibility rules versus uninformed of the eligibility rules would have on the government budget. So I do this because in some of this salience literature, or in some kind of behavioral literature, there's a view that sometimes the government might optimally want to obfuscate part of the tax system to kind of mitigate against kind of bad behavioral responses. So for example, it could be that we think a government might want to obfuscate a sales tax because that would do away with the deadweight costs arising from the induced substitution effects. So just to kind of complete this welfare exercise, I think about the government budget as well. I think about whether the government would be better or worse off if households are informed or not informed about these rules. Okay, so this table shows a kind of breakdown of my results from this exercise. So I'm just going to kind of walk through the lines of this table now. So in row 1, this is the compensating variation. This is the average reduction in period 0 assets that a household would be willing to accept to be informed about the rules rather than uninformed for the entirety of their working life. And I find that a household would be willing to pay on average £18,400 at age 20 to not make these mistakes. So this is a huge welfare cost, I think, especially given that we're considering particularly low-income families. And I think part of the reason that this welfare cost is so big is because the policy that I'm thinking about here is so fundamentally dynamic. So the optimal thing to do, like the thing that a household would like to do, would be to work a little bit more, consume a little bit less, and so build savings gradually over the entirety of their working life in anticipation of losing their benefits. And by not being able to do that, you know, they're kind of making small mistakes over a number of periods, and these compound up until you reach kind of age 40 or 45 and your kid becomes ineligible, and suddenly you're really far away from the amount of savings that you would optimally like to have. The amount these households are willing to pay to avoid that situation is commensurately big. So this second line is just adjusting the 18,000 for the proportion of households which are unaware of the rules. Just to kind of get a sense for the magnitude of this welfare cost, in lines 3 and 4, I express this £18,000 as a proportion of the present value of lifetime receipts from child tax credit for the households in the model. So the present value of child tax credits receipts is around £110,000 for these model households. So this £18,000 is like 14% of this. So this is saying that the welfare costs are equivalent to reducing child tax credit by 14%. So given that I showed at the beginning the policy costs the UK government around £17.5 billion a year, the government could in principle save 14% of that and keep claimants equally well off if only they were able to help them understand these dynamic features better. Then in these final rows, I show the effect on the government budget. Really, the takeaway here is that, in row 5, I show the net government receipts. So this is taxes less the benefits paid out for the government if households are fully aware of the eligibility rules. In row 6, I show the same object for households that are unaware. And really the takeaway here is that it doesn't make much of a difference to the government whether households are aware of the rules or not. These kind of differences arise because of different labour supply and consumption patterns over the life cycle, giving a different profile of tax receipts. But you know, these are small change relative to the size of the welfare cost to the individual families. So the takeaway from this is that there's a substantial welfare cost to the claimants without any good reason, without any kind of offsetting good reason for the government. So that is kind of pure inefficient. That's pure inefficiency. This is a bad feature of the policy. Okay, so I'm just going to wrap up now. I'm kind of very happy to take other questions as well, but so in this paper I provide new evidence of a non-salient dynamic policy feature as part of a kind of real world and flagship welfare program in the UK. I'm able to rule out alternative explanations, so I hope that I've convinced you that my findings are salience and learning and not something else. I'd of course be happy to talk about that. And I document the claimants learn about these rules through experience. I then incorporate salience into a structural life cycle labour supply model, which I estimate key parameters of using the empirical results as targets. And I use the estimated model to think about the welfare costs of this policy, which I find are substantial with no offsetting benefits to government. So the kind of takeaway is this previously undocumented source of inefficiency in the welfare system that introduces a new way that we might understand that this policy is inefficient. Okay. So thank you very much for coming, and thank you for the questions as well. I'm happy to take other questions now if people have them. Hi. Oh, I think you're muted.
Go ahead, Stefani. I think you're muted.
Yes. That's the, yeah. So no, thank you very much. I really like this paper. I think I don't have much to add, because I have to say I'm convinced about your results, and I also really like the welfare analysis. I think it's really complete the paper nicely.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, so I think it's a really interesting result, and to me all that comes to mind is all other possible outcomes that you might want to look at, and probably it would make another paper. But really all issues, if this is really an unexpected shock, all issues that have to do with mental health, or even the choices of the kids. This is a critical age where they are making decision about university or job market, and whether this and usually this is also a family decision, and whether this can also have implications for their choices at this critical point.
Yeah, so that's a great suggestion. Thank you. So the mental health thing is a really nice thought, and I hadn't thought about that, but I think that would be well worth thinking about, especially like in the context of thinking about the UK welfare system, where it's not good for people's mental health. I think
it could feature as an extension of this paper if it remains in additional sections, but it could potentially be a completely different opinion.
So thank you. The other thing you mentioned was about children's choices. So I have some stuff in this paper that I didn't show in the talk about, which I really think of as a robustness check to see that the treatment and control groups are suitably comparable. But I think would actually answer this question as well. So I look at whether the child goes to university, and I was kind of surprised to find that there isn't a difference between the treatment and control group in the probability that the kid goes to university, which I can only really explain by, I think, this was the early 2000s, where there was a big drive towards getting people to stay in education, and tuition fees were much lower, and so it doesn't seem to have an effect on whether the child goes to university. It also doesn't seem to have an effect on whether the child remains at home or leaves home. But I mean, maybe there are other outcomes for the kids as well, which would be worth looking into.
Yeah, thank you.
Are there any other questions for Peter? Yes, Nia, go ahead.
Hi. This might be just a misunderstanding or just missing out on some point, and I'm sure you've thought about it, but I was just wondering if you could clarify. Now, so what I understood was that, so what you're trying to show is that when the first child loses benefit, basically the labor supply increases for the woman, and you don't see the increase for the following children. Yeah. Now, I mean, what I'm wondering, and I'm sure that you've taken into account, is that surely there is only so many hours that a mother can increase labor supply, right? So is it possible? I mean, have you taken into account the fact that it might just be that the mother is working the extra hours that she could work, so another 8 hours or whatever when the first child has turned 18, and that's it?
Yeah, this is a really fantastic point. So this is a good question, and it's a kind of difficult question. So yes, it could of course be the case that there are, and especially if we think of labour supply as being a discrete choice between part-time, full-time, and out of work, then yeah, like if you're full-time, then maybe there's kind of very little you can do. So there's a few ways that I would kind of try and convince you that this isn't what's going on. So first is so the concern I think that you have is that my asymmetry between the first and subsequent kids is just driven by these constraints on the labor supply and not by kind of a story of learning, which I would respond to that by pointing to the results for the large and small families and saying that those results do actually show that the parents are able to adjust their labor supply by more if there's more of a need to increase their labor supply by more, if that makes sense. You know, the size of the labor supply response is sensitive to the size of the benefit shock, and that is consistent with this story of learning, as well as just this asymmetry between the first and second kid. So I'd kind of say that I hope that that is kind of a secondary piece of evidence that helps get around some of these concerns. The other thing I would say actually as well is that it's certainly not the case that mothers in the treatment group are working full time. So it seems to be about, you know, about 60% of mothers are working, and so it seems to me that there is. I mean, of course, the mothers who are not working might have constraints that we don't see that mean that they fundamentally can't work, but it really does seem as though there's adjustment, there's room to adjust labour supply further than has already happened. So I hope that's kind of answered the question.
Yes, thank you. Can I also ask another question, if that's all right? Yeah, if you have the time. Okay, very quickly. So right at the end, you compared the welfare cost, or rather what the family was losing out versus what the government was losing out. Yeah. Now, what would be your equivalent policy sort of suggestion in this regard? And this I'm just asking out of curiosity, so you do not have to, you know, have very specific answer, but I was just wondering what your thoughts were.
Yeah. Okay. So policy is another very good question. So, so what I'm able to say from this, so I'm able to say some broad things on the basis of this paper about what policy should be. So I think the first thing I'm able to say, which kind of sounds obvious, is I'm able to say that there is a policy problem to be solved, and this isn't kind of obvious ex ante, because, you know, like you wouldn't necessarily know that there was a policy problem. And I hope that by ruling out some of these alternative explanations, I'm able to kind of narrow the set of appropriate policy responses that might be appropriate. So, for example, by showing that it's by arguing that it's not time inconsistency, we can think this isn't a thing where the government needs to be helping people commit to save more, for example. So it really does seem to be a question about salience, not knowing about the policy. So I think there are, within that set of kind of policy responses, there are two things which I'm not able to tell between in this paper. One is interventions that provide information. So there are some, you know, as part of the policy environment, parents do get sent information that their benefits will expire, but they get it very close to when they actually do expire, so kind of within 6 months. So maybe better information interventions would improve outcomes. The other broad kind of policy thing that you might want to do is think about simplifying the system in some sense. So maybe if, you know, that there's this feature where the child tax credit is paid jointly with some other benefits, maybe that's a bad idea, for example. But I don't have strong conclusions on that. I'm actually working on exactly this question now, or I have some early work on it, where I'm thinking about using the rollout of universal credit, which has been the successor to these benefits, as thinking about the impacts of simplifying the welfare system and what effects that might have. But I don't have anything to say more about that yet, unfortunately. But it's a great question.
Yes, if I can follow. Yeah, that made me think about exactly that. That you mentioned the fact that the benefits are given jointly, and is that anywhere you can look at that in your data and see whether the response, there's more learning when there is only one of the two benefits. Yes,
yeah,
you have. Okay.
Yeah, well, I mean, I have. I don't. The thing I don't know is whether I have it, which is not a particularly credible thing to say.
Because that would give you some support for making some policy recommendation to get the results.
So I can't. Okay. So I can't find the results. So yeah. So like, you're free to not believe me. Yes. So I have looked at this about whether, if you look at the responses for people who are just getting child tax credit, whether they're different from people with working tax credit, and they are smaller. Like there are smaller responses, which is consistent with this story. The thing that I'm hesitant about with these results is that the set of families who are claiming child tax credit but not working tax credit may be in order to qualify for working tax credit, you have to be working a certain number of hours. So these are households that fundamentally are not working. And it could be that we think that these are the households where maybe some of these labour supply frictions apply the most. And so maybe finding a smaller response for these child tax credit only households is just picking up that these are constrained households for other reasons. And so I'm kind of a bit hesitant about these results, but that feature is there in the data.
Thanks. I know we're running a little bit short on time here. I just wanted to sort of have one quick comment about whether or not the salience is about the policy itself. So do I not know that that I'm going to have this sort of uneven cut in my income stream, or am I learning about that, or am I learning about my own preferences, right? So I might think that my preferences are not very convex, right? So I can think, oh, well, when the first child goes away, I can just sort of pick up by working more, and then sort of that happens, and I realize, oh no, that's actually that's not great. So when it sort of comes to later children, I'll sort of anticipate a little bit more, and I think part of that could sort of just be answered by survey evidence on whether or not people are aware of how much benefits they're getting, and when those benefits are going to come to an end.
Yeah. So this is a very nice point. Yeah. So the question is it just that I think I'll be fine when I lose the benefits, and then when I lose them, I realize I'm not, and I have to go out and get a job? And okay, so one thing I can say is that there is some survey evidence from government researchers that people are directly on unawareness of the budget sets. So there's been this study where they look at people who are claiming working tax credit and child tax credit. And they basically ask them to say how much of what you're getting is because of your kids, and they don't know. So I think that's kind of supports my story. The other thing that I could say, which is maybe a weak thing to say, so apologies in advance, is that my structural model explicitly makes the assumption that you know your preferences, but that you don't know your budget set. And it just so happens that quantitatively, a model like that is able to explain my findings. So that's a weak thing to say, because it could, of course, also be that quantitatively a model like the one you have in mind would also be able to explain my findings, and I can't rule that out. So yeah, I think I can certainly say that my story is consistent. I can't say that your story is inconsistent, except for maybe some of this other evidence, this kind of secondary evidence that people don't seem to know their budget sets, which maybe supports my story a bit. But yeah, I mean, it's a great point about the preferences.
Are there any remaining questions? I guess they'd have to be real quick for Peter before we adjourn today.
Can you hear my dog in the background?
Yeah, I can. No, I empathize. Sort of my dog is sort of sitting right below me and sort of angling for another walk at the moment.
Okay, well, thank you very much for hosting and for the great questions. Of course, please feel free to get in touch with me if there's anything that you'd like to ask further.
Yeah, no, it's a great paper, Peter, and a great presentation. Thanks for coming here and talking to us, and thanks everyone for participating.
Okay, yeah, great. Thank you all very much again. It's been great.
Thank you, Peter. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Peter.
Bye.